Story begins. The envelope was sealed with tape so old it had turned amber. Vernon Polk set it on the security desk without a word, the way a man sets down something he has carried for a long time and is finally ready to put down. His hands were large, knuckle-thick, the kind of hands that had pushed mops across miles of tile floor and changed 10,000 light bulbs in the dark hours before the rest of the world woke up. He was wearing his work clothes even though today was his last day. Gray uniform pants, a navy blue shirt with the university seal stitched above the left breast pocket. He had pressed both garments that morning, as he had pressed them every morning for 35 years, because his mother had told him that how you dressed for work was how you respected the work. Inside the envelope was his master keyring. 41 keys, each one labeled in his handwriting with a strip of white tape and a fine point marker. Building designations, room numbers, sub-basement access codes. 41 keys that opened every locked door on the Crestfield University campus, except the ones that required card access, and he had memorized those combinations anyway. He didn't write those down. Some things you kept only in your head. The young security officer at the desk, Tyler Brandt, 24 years old and 3 months into the job, took the envelope and signed for it without looking up from his computer. Standard checkout procedure. Employee departure inventory. Vernon watched him sign. Tyler did not say thank you, did not say congratulations on the retirement, did not say anything at all beyond the procedural murmur of someone filling out a form. Vernon was not offended. He had spent 35 years being looked past. He understood it the way a man understands weather. You don't take it personally. It simply is. He walked out of the security office and down the corridor of the administrative building, past the framed photographs of university presidents, past the glass cases displaying championship trophies from the 1970s, past the bulletin boards layered with notices about parking permits and campus events and food drives. He had cleaned every surface in this corridor, polished every trophy case, straightened every bulletin board so the paper aligned with the edge. None of that was recorded anywhere. None of that had a name attached. At the main exit, he pushed through the heavy glass doors and walked out into the October morning. Cold, clean air. The campus spread before him, red and gold leaves on the oaks that lined the central path. Students moved between buildings in clusters, heads down over phones, backpacks heavy. He had watched them arrive for 35 years, 18 years old and scared and trying not to show it, and watched them leave 4 years later, 22 and certain of things they would later have to unlearn. He had watched more students pass through than he could count. None of them had ever learned his name. He walked to the parking lot where his truck waited, a 1997 Ford F-150 in a shade of blue that had faded toward gray. Got in, put his hands on the wheel, sat. He was 68 years old. He had no pension beyond Social Security and a modest 403B that his daughter had made him start contributing to 15 years ago. He had a house that was paid off, which was something. He had a vegetable garden in the backyard and a woodworking shop in the garage, and a daughter who called him every Sunday, and 3 grandchildren whose names he knew and who did not know him well enough yet. He did not think about the 42 keys any more than he thought about the locker. That was the habit of a man who had learned, very specifically and at great cost, not to think about certain things. But the locker was still there. He was certain of it. Room B7 in the sub-basement of Whitmore Hall, the old mathematics building that had been scheduled for renovation twice in the past decade, and both times had the renovation deferred due to budget shortfalls. He had cleaned the hallway outside room B7 for 35 years, polished the floor, changed the fluorescent lights when they flickered, checked the door to make sure it was locked, and walked past. He had not been inside since 1991. He started the truck and drove home. Tyler Brandt found the extra key on a Thursday morning, 11 days after Vernon Polk's retirement. He was doing a routine inventory of the key return envelopes, cross-referencing each key against the master building registry, when he noticed that the count was off. 41 keys had been logged in the return record. The master registry showed 42 active assignments for Vernon Polk, custodial staff, badge number 147. The discrepancy was small. It was the kind of thing that slipped through during busy checkout procedures, when the security officer signing the form was more interested in the database field he was supposed to complete than in actually counting the keys. Tyler counted twice to make sure. 41 in the envelope, 42 in the system. The missing key was logged under a designation he didn't recognize. Not a building code, not a room number in the standard format. It read, WHB7 Priv, Whitmore Hall, sub-basement. The Privy designation wasn't in his training materials. He flagged it for his supervisor, a woman named Diane Okafor, who had been in the security office for 12 years and who approached anomalies with the calm efficiency of someone who had seen most things. She looked at the inventory sheet, looked at the designation, and pulled up the legacy access records. The WHB7 Priv designation appeared in the system under a filing category labeled Archived Inactive, last updated in 1989. The associated record listed the space as a private study room, access restricted to authorized academic personnel, assigned status closed. Who authorized it? Diane asked. The authorization signature in the digital record had been entered as a scanned document. She opened the scan. The original paper was yellowed. The signature was in a name she didn't know. Department of Mathematics, 1987. She tried to cross-reference the name in the faculty directory. No results. Tried the emeritus list. No results. Tried the alumni database, the staff records, the archived personnel files. Nothing. The name in the signature was Dr. H. Caldwell. She sent Tyler down to check the room. Whitmore Hall's sub-basement smelled like old concrete and something electrical, the specific odor of circuitry that had not been powered in a long time but had once burned hot. Tyler walked down the stairwell with a flashlight and the building master key, which opened the sub-basement access door at the bottom. The corridor beyond was narrow, 6 feet wide, ceiling low with exposed pipe. Water stains on the concrete floor in patterns that suggested decades of occasional flooding. Fluorescent tubes overhead, several of them dark. Room B7 was at the far end. The door was metal, painted beige, the paint chipped at the corners. A standard academic building interior door with a brass lock set that looked older than the building's last renovation in 1978. He tried the master key. It did not turn. He photographed the lock, the door, the designation plate mounted beside it. Sent the photos to Diane. She told him to find out if Physical Plant had a duplicate key for that lock. Physical Plant did not. Physical Plant had no record of the lock, the door, or the room. Diane Okafor called Vernon Polk on a Friday afternoon. She had his contact information from the HR system. He answered on the second ring. His voice was unhurried, the voice of a man who had nowhere to be. "Mr. Polk," she explained, "we're doing a routine inventory reconciliation, and we believe you may have retained a key from your issued set. Not intentionally, of course. These things happen. I was hoping you could help us locate it." There was a pause. Not a confused pause, not a searching pause, a deliberate one. "Which key?" Vernon asked. WHB7 Priv, Whitmore Hall, sub-basement. Another pause. "I can come in Monday morning," he said, "around 9. "That would be very helpful," she said. He arrived at 8:47. He was wearing pressed slacks and a button-down shirt. He carried a small thermos of coffee and nothing else. He did not look like a man who had forgotten a key. He looked like a man who had made a decision. He met Diane in the security office. She offered him a seat. He accepted it, but sat the way people sit who are accustomed to not being invited to sit, with a certain correctness that suggested awareness of the accommodation. "I have the key," he said. "I didn't forget it." She waited. "I kept it deliberately." He turned the thermos in his hands. "When I left, I wasn't sure what to do about it. I thought about bringing it back. I thought about what happens when I bring it back and someone opens that room without understanding what's in it." He paused. "I decided I needed some time to think." "What's in the room?" Diane asked. Vernon looked at her steadily. He had gray eyes, she noticed, pale and sharp, and not at all the eyes of a man who had spent his career mopping floors. "Things I left there a long time ago," he said. "Things that belong to me. things that might also belong to other people, depending on how you look at it. I'm going to need you to be more specific. He set the thermos on her desk, reached into his shirt pocket, and placed a key on the desk. Brass. Old. Worn smooth at the bow from years of handling. I'll open the room, he said, but I want to be there when you do, and I want to call my daughter first. Diane agreed to those terms, which was perhaps the first indication that she understood she was not dealing with a clerical error. They went down to the sub-basement at 10 o'clock that morning. Vernon walked the corridor ahead of her with familiarity, choosing his steps around the water stain near Pipe Junction 3 without looking down, which was the kind of automatic navigation that came from decades of repetition. Tyler walked behind them both. At room B7, Vernon stopped. He held the key for a moment. Then he fitted in the lock and turned it. The door swung open. The smell was immediately distinctive. Old paper. Something chemical, faintly sweet. Stale air that had been sitting for a very long time. Tyler shone his flashlight inside. Diane found the light switch on the wall to the left of the door, a habit learned from being in many unfamiliar rooms, and clicked it. An overhead fluorescent buzzed and stuttered, and then held. The room was 12 feet by 14 feet. The walls were covered with corkboard that had been layered so many times with papers that the cork itself was invisible. Most of the papers had fallen or half fallen, held in place only by pins that had been pushed in at angles and by the pressure of adjacent papers. Yellow with age, edges curled. On the floor, stacked in plastic crates and cardboard boxes sealed with tape that had long since dried and cracked, were notebooks. Dozens of them, black hardcover composition notebooks, the standard academic kind, stacked carefully, organized in some system that was not immediately apparent from the outside. A metal desk occupied the right wall. On it sat a lamp with a bulb burned out, a magnifying glass, a coffee mug that had been rinsed but not washed, its interior stained dark, and a typewriter, not electric, manual. A 1960s-era Olivetti portable, still loaded with a sheet of paper. Tyler stepped inside. Vernon stayed in the doorway. "What is all this?" Tyler asked. "Work," Vernon said. His voice was very quiet. Tyler walked to the desk, looked at the paper loaded in the typewriter. Mathematical notation, dense, symbols he didn't recognize. He picked up a notebook from one of the open crates. Inside the cover, in handwriting so small and precise it was almost printed, were equations. Page after page of them. No names, no dates on the early pages, just the mathematics. He flipped toward the middle. A date appeared in the margin. October 14th, 1986. He flipped to the back. The last dated entry read, March 3rd, 1991. He looked at Vernon. Vernon was watching him from the doorway. The expression on his face was the expression of a man watching someone handle something fragile. "You wrote these?" Tyler asked. "Yes." Diane stepped inside, looked around the room carefully, the way a person looks at something they are trying to classify and cannot quite place. "Mr. Polk," she said, "help me understand what I'm looking at." Vernon crossed the threshold into the room. He stood in the center of it and looked at the walls, at the fallen papers, at the boxes of notebooks, at the typewriter on the desk. Something moved in his face. Not emotion exactly, more like recognition. "I was a mathematician," he said. "Before I was a custodian, I was a mathematician." He told them the short version that morning, standing in the basement room, because the short version was the only version he had given anyone in 30 years, and it was all he felt capable of giving without preparation. He had been a graduate student at Crestfield University from 1975 to 1979, mathematics department. His focus was cryptographic systems, specifically the mathematical structures underlying encryption algorithms. He had arrived from a small town in rural Georgia on a full scholarship, the first person in his family to attend a university at all, and he had found in mathematics something that felt like language, the first language in which he was naturally fluent. His advisor had been Dr. Harold Caldwell. "A brilliant man," Vernon said, and then paused as though he was deciding what else to say about Dr. Harold Caldwell. He left it at brilliant. In 1978, during his third year, Vernon had begun working on a theoretical framework for what he described to Diane and Tyler simply as a different approach to key generation. He did not explain further, because the mathematics required to explain further was not a thing that could be done standing in a basement room in 10 minutes. In 1979, he had completed his dissertation. He submitted it to Dr. Caldwell. He waited for the defense date that would formalize his doctorate. The defense date never came. Dr. Caldwell requested a 6-month extension for additional review. This was unusual, but not unheard of. Vernon waited. After 6 months, another extension was requested. After that, Dr. Caldwell became difficult to reach. The department chair informed Vernon, in a meeting that Vernon described as brief and uncomfortable, that his dissertation was undergoing review by external evaluators and that he should continue his work independently while the process completed. He had continued his work. Here, in this room, which Dr. Caldwell had arranged for him as a private study space in 1977, on the grounds that concentrated work required a concentrated environment. He had continued for 12 more years, refining, extending, building on the original framework. But that wasn't the full story, not even close. The years between 1979 and 1991 were not years of simple continuation. They were years of parallel lives, of a man who showed up to one existence every morning and lived inside another one in the dark hours before and after. Vernon had learned to sleep in increments, 4 hours before the 3 a.m. shift, 2 hours after returning, an hour in the late afternoon if the route had been light. The body adapted to deprivation with a practicality that the mind found difficult to admire but learned to rely on. He had worked the overnight shift for the first 9 years, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., moving through the university's buildings in the silence that settled after midnight, when the last graduate students finally cleared out of the libraries and the only sounds were the HVAC systems and his cart and the particular acoustic quality of large empty spaces. He had learned to love those hours, not with sentimentality, but with the specific appreciation of a man who had found in them something no one was trying to take from him. In the basement room, from 4 to 6 a.m. on the nights when the route ended early, he had written. He had kept a small lamp, its cord running to the outlet beside the door, and a thermos of coffee, and the notebooks. The work had continued across those years with a consistency that had nothing to do with optimism and everything to do with habit and need. The mathematics was the only place where the world still made the kind of sense he had been trained to expect. Cause and consequence, rigor and result. A proof was a proof regardless of who discovered it, or when, or whether anyone ever came to know. And the mathematics was good. He knew it was good. This was perhaps the cruelest part of the situation, the part he did not describe in detail to Diane and Tyler that morning, because describing it in detail would have required a precision of pain he was not willing to perform. He knew the quality of his own work. He had been trained by people whose judgment was reliable, had read enough of the literature to understand where his contribution sat within it, and he knew that what was in the notebooks was significant in ways that went beyond what even Dr. Caldwell had framed it as when he first pointed Vernon toward the problem. Vernon had exceeded the question he had been given. That was the honest assessment. He had never stopped being able to make that assessment. In 1991, he had stopped. "Why?" Diane asked. "Because I understood by then that it didn't matter," he said. "Whatever I was going to do with it, someone had already done something with it first." "What does that mean?" He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he picked up one of the notebooks, opened it to a middle page, and handed it to her. "This," he said, pointing to a specific block of notation, "is the theoretical basis for a key exchange protocol that was patented in 1987 by a defense contractor called Vantage Systems Solutions. The patent is held by the federal government. The system it describes is still in use in certain secure communication networks." Diane looked at the notation. She could not evaluate the mathematics. She could see that it was dense and specific. She looked up at Vernon. "You're saying they took your work?" she asked. He took the notebook back from her, closed it gently, set it down on the desk beside the Olivetti. "I'm saying," he said carefully, "that I wrote this in 1978. The patent was filed in 1987 by a company that Dr. Caldwell joined as a senior consultant in 1980, 1 year after he received my dissertation." He paused. "I'm not saying anything more than that." Tyler had gone very still. Vernon looked around the room one more time, at the papers on the walls, at the years of work stacked in plastic crates. "I cleaned the hallway outside this door for 35 years, he said. "Every Tuesday and Friday, 6 in the morning. And I never told anyone what was in here." "Why not?" Tyler asked. "Because," Vernon said, "I didn't think anyone would believe a janitor." Diane Okafor spent 4 days deciding what to do. She was a security professional. Her job was campus safety, access management, and protocol compliance. What Vernon Polk had described to her was not within any professional framework she had been trained to address. It was, by its nature, something larger, older, more complicated. She pulled the patent records herself on her home computer because she did not want this going through the university network before she understood what she was looking at. She found the Vantage System Solutions patent from 1987, patent number 4000-18094, filed under the category of cryptographic key exchange systems. The abstract described a method for generating asymmetric encryption keys using a specific mathematical structure. She was not a mathematician. She printed the abstract and the technical summary. She asked a friend who taught computer science at a community college to look at it. Her friend looked at it for 15 minutes and said it was a foundational piece of work in applied cryptography. Significant. She asked if it was the kind of thing that could have been developed by a single researcher working alone in the late 1970s. Her friend looked at her sideways and said that yes, theoretically, someone working at the frontier of the field in 1978 could have produced this. It was that kind of theoretical leap, the kind of thing that didn't come from committee work. She asked Vernon to come back in on Tuesday. She had called his daughter as well, whose name was Renata, and who arrived with Vernon looking like a woman who had been waiting for a specific phone call for a long time, and was only now processing that it had finally come. In the conference room off the security office, with Tyler present and a recording running with everyone's consent, Vernon told the longer version. Dr. Harold Caldwell had been more than his advisor. In the early years, he had been something close to a mentor. Vernon was 22 when he arrived at Crestfield, the only black graduate student in the mathematics department, and Caldwell had taken an interest in him that felt, at the time, like recognition, like seeing. Caldwell was 50, established, well-connected. He arranged the study room. He introduced Vernon to visiting scholars. He included him in departmental conversations that graduate students were not normally included in. Vernon had trusted him. The dissertation had been the culmination of 4 years of work on a problem that Caldwell had pointed him toward. Caldwell had framed it as an open question in the field. He had said, with the enthusiasm of a man who loved mathematics, that solving it would be significant. He had watched Vernon work on it with the attention of a man watching something grow. After Vernon submitted the dissertation in 1979, the communication changed. Slowly at first, then completely. The extension requests, the unavailability, the department chair's careful language. Vernon had not known, at 26, how to respond to institutional silence. He had not grown up with access to lawyers or professional advocates or people who understood how academic power structures operated when they were operating against you. He had grown up in a household where you put your head down and you worked and you trusted that the work would speak for itself. He had waited. He had continued working, here, in the room that still had his name on the access list because no one had thought to remove it, or perhaps because removing it would have required acknowledging it, which would have raised questions. In 1980, he had been offered a position, not an academic position, a staff position, custodial services, full benefits, union contract. The offer had come through an administrative process that he had not applied to. Someone had arranged it. He had never been able to prove who. He had taken the job. He said this without drama. He said it the way he had lived it, as a fact, as something that had happened that he had found a way to continue past. His daughter was crying quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "I had a family to take care of," he said. "My mother was sick. I had rent. I took the job." He paused, and I kept working, down here when I could, not because I thought it would lead anywhere, but because stopping would have been worse than continuing. Tyler asked quietly if he had ever contacted anyone, a lawyer, a journalist, anyone. Vernon looked at him, his gray eyes patient, almost kind. "Once," he said, "in 1985, I wrote a letter to a professor at MIT who was publishing work adjacent to my field. I explained my situation. I included some of my notation." He paused. "I received a response from a lawyer representing Vantage System Solutions. The letter informed me that any claims to proprietary cryptographic material were subject to legal review and that further disclosure could constitute a violation of federal intellectual property law." He set his hands flat on the table. "I was 29. I had no money. I had a daughter who was 2 years old." He stopped talking. The room was very quiet. "I understood what I was being told," he said. What he did not say, in that first telling, was that there had been a second letter. The first letter, from the Vantage System Solutions lawyer, had been delivered to the address he had listed as his contact in the university directory, which was a small apartment on Elm Street he shared with his mother after her move from Georgia following the diagnosis. His mother had brought it in from the mailbox not knowing what it was, had set it on the kitchen table, and had watched him open it and read it, and then fold it and set it down with a steadiness that she had recognized from a lifetime of watching him, as the steadiness of someone absorbing a blow. She had not asked what it said. She had made coffee. He had sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours, the letter in front of him, thinking through the geometry of his situation with the same clarity he applied to mathematical problems. Because clarity was the only tool he had, and using it was better than not using it. The geometry was this. He had no money, he had a sick mother, he had a girlfriend who was 3 months pregnant with their daughter, he had a job offer on the table from the university's custodial services department, and he had a letter from a law firm that represented a defense contractor informing him that his continued development and discussion of certain cryptographic materials could expose him to federal legal action. He was 29 years old. The second letter arrived 4 weeks later. It was not from a law firm. It was handwritten in an envelope with no return address, postmarked from Washington, D.C. The handwriting was not Dr. Caldwell's, which he would have recognized. It was someone else's. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first acknowledged that he had received the legal notice from Vantage System Solutions. The second said that his work had been reviewed by people whose opinion on these matters carried weight, and that its quality had been noted. The third said that there were circumstances in which the acknowledgement of his contribution could be arranged quietly, and without public exposure of the manner in which the work had come to be used, and that this arrangement would require his cooperation and his silence, and that if he was interested in discussing terms, he should indicate his interest through a specific channel that the letter described. He had read the letter 4 times. Then he had burned it in the kitchen sink. He had understood immediately, and with the clarity that had been both his gift and his difficulty throughout his life, exactly what the letter represented. It was not an offer of justice. It was an offer of management. Someone had realized that a loose end existed and was proposing to neaten it in a way that served their interests, while providing him with the minimum necessary to prevent him from becoming a problem. The terms, whatever they were, would have required him to sign something, to accept something, to put his name on his own disappearance. He had not been willing to do that. He had taken the job in custodial services. He had continued his work in the basement room. He had said nothing to anyone. But he had kept the key. That, he explained, was the decision that mattered. In the geometry of the situation, as he had mapped it at 29, the key was the one thing that remained solely his. The room was his. The notebooks were his. The mathematics was his. As long as the door was locked and the key was in his possession, the record existed. It could not be claimed that the work did not exist. It could not be argued that the room had never been occupied. The physical evidence of 40 years of thought was behind that door, and the door stayed locked because he held the key. He had held it for 35 years. The day he retired, standing in the security office with the envelope of 41 keys in his hand, he had made a decision, not impulsively. He had been thinking about it for the better part of a year, since he had received a letter from the Howard University professor, asking if there were any elderly black scientists or mathematicians whose stories had not been told, a mass inquiry sent to various university departments, and his name had apparently been in someone's file somewhere, and the letter had found its way to him through a forwarding system that still had his address from his graduate school years. He had not responded to that letter, but he had begun for the first time in decades to consider the question of what came next, not for himself specifically, for the work. The work deserved a record that wasn't a locked room. He had kept the key, and eventually it was the right question that found it. Renata Polk was 40 years old, an attorney who worked in employment law in Charlotte, North Carolina. She had driven 4 hours to Crestfield because her father had called her Sunday evening and said simply that some things had come up and he thought she should be there. She had grown up knowing her father was different without knowing exactly how or why. There were things about him that did not fit the frame of custodian. The way he read, the precision of his handwriting, the evenings he spent in the garage not woodworking, but at his desk, with notebooks, writing things she was not allowed to look at, which she had respected because he asked her to respect it and because he asked for very little. The way he watched news coverage of technology and encryption with an expression she had categorized, growing up, as sadness, but which she now understood was something more specific. She had asked him once, when she was 12, why he worked as a janitor if he was so smart. He had looked at her for a moment. Then he had said that smart had nothing to do with it, and that she should remember that. She had filed the answer away without understanding it. She was understanding it now. In the conference room, while her father spoke, Renata had been running a parallel legal analysis in her head with the competency of someone who did this for a living. Statute of limitations on intellectual property theft was a thicket. Federal contractor involvement complicated matters significantly. The age of the material would be an issue. The absence of formal patent filing in Vernon's name would be an issue. But the notebooks were time-stamped by the composition of their content. Expert analysis could establish chronology. The typewriter ribbon, if still present, was potentially analyzable. The paper itself had aging properties. And the MIT lawyer's letter, if Vernon still had it, was evidence of awareness. She had a lot of questions. But the first thing she did, after Vernon stopped speaking, was reach across the conference table and put her hand over his. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "You should have told me," she said. "I didn't want you carrying it," he said. She pressed her hand down harder. "It wasn't yours to carry alone either." She was angry. She was careful not to show the anger in the room because it was not useful there. It was a private anger, dense and specific, the anger of a daughter who had watched her father press his uniform every single morning of her childhood, who had eaten dinner with him in a silence that she had interpreted as contentment and now understood as the practiced quiet of a man who had learned that speaking certain things aloud cost more than keeping them in. She had asked him once, when she was 12, why he worked as a janitor if he was so smart. He had said that smart had nothing to do with it, and that she should remember that. She had filed the answer away, and carried it through law school and 15 years of practice, and had reached, finally, the moment where she understood what he meant. Smart had nothing to do with it. The world was not organized around intelligence. It was organized around access and documentation and the willingness of institutions to acknowledge what they had taken. Smart people were erased all the time. The only thing that prevented erasure was a record. Her father had kept a record. He had kept it in a locked room with a key he never returned, and that was the most lawyerly thing she had ever heard. and she told him so on the drive back to his house that evening, when the adrenaline of the conference room had settled, and they were just two people in a truck on a county road in October. He had laughed. A short sound surprised out of him. "I didn't think of it that way," he said. "You kept evidence," she said, "for 35 years. He looked out the window at the passing fields. "I kept the work," he said. "I kept it because it was mine, and I wasn't going to let it cease to exist just because someone wanted it to." She drove the rest of the way in silence, thinking about the difference between those two things. Keeping evidence, keeping the work. They were the same action and completely different intentions, and her father had done both simultaneously without separating them, which was the kind of thing that happened when a mathematician built a life around the assumption that eventually, given enough time, things would resolve into their correct configuration. She pulled into his driveway, turned off the engine. Sat. "Dad," she said, "I need you to tell me everything. Every conversation with Caldwell, the timeline, the department chair meeting, the lawyer letter, the second letter." He turned to look at her. His expression did not change, but something behind it did. Recognition. Relief, maybe. The specific relief of someone who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just been asked to hand it over. "How do you know about a second letter?" he asked. "I don't," she said. "But there was one. There's always a second letter." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come inside. I'll put coffee on." They sat at his kitchen table until nearly midnight. He talked. She wrote. The handwriting in her notebook became denser as the hours progressed, more abbreviated, because her hand was moving faster than the story, and she did not want to lose any of it. At the end, when he had told her everything, including the part about burning the second letter in the kitchen sink 29 years ago, she sat back and looked at what she had written. "You understand," he said, "that I burned a document that would have been very useful." "I understand," she said, "but you understood at 29 that accepting what it offered would have been worse than losing the evidence." He looked at her. "You've thought about this," she said. "I've had 39 years to think about it." She closed the notebook, pressed her hand flat on the cover. "I'm going to need to bring in help," she said. "People who specialize in this. Government contractor IP cases, federal patent disputes. This is bigger than my practice." He nodded. "It's going to take time," she said. "Real time. Years, probably." He looked at her with the gray eyes that she had always found difficult to read, and which she could read perfectly now, in the kitchen of the house she had grown up in. At midnight, with a notebook full of 40 years of a man's suppressed history between them. "I've been patient," he said. "I know," she said. "You've been too patient. But I mean a different kind of time now. Active time. Documented time. The kind of time that builds a case." He said, "What do you need from me?" She said, "Everything you remember. Every date, every name, every conversation. We're going to reconstruct the timeline from the notebooks and your memory and whatever documentation survived. We're going to make this airtight." He nodded once. The way he nodded in the congressional hearing later. The way he nodded when things were decided. Then he got up and refilled both their coffee cups without being asked. What happened next took time. Not weeks, not months, years, in the way that institutional reckonings take years, moving through stages that feel insufficient and then suddenly significant and then insufficient again. Diane Okafor, for her part, made a decision that was professionally unusual and personally clear. She documented everything. She created a chain of custody for the room and its contents that was meticulous beyond what her job required. She requested that the university administration be formally notified. She wrote her own incident report in language precise enough that it could not be summarized away. The university administration received the notification and entered a phase that Renata, watching it from the outside, described to her colleagues as controlled panic. They convened a committee. They hired outside counsel. They issued a statement expressing their commitment to thorough review. None of these actions were, on their own, meaningful. but they were the scaffolding of a process that could, if pressure was maintained, become meaningful. The university's response had a particular quality that Renata had learned over 15 years to recognize. It was the quality of an institution that understood it had a problem and was not yet certain how large the problem was. They were careful. Meetings were held at the level of general counsel and provost and various deans whose involvement required them to read documents they had not previously known existed. The mathematics department chair, a man of 52 who had joined the faculty in 1998 and had no personal knowledge of the events in question, found himself reading files from an era that predated his arrival and developing, over the course of several weeks, a specific expression that Renata came to recognize as the expression of a person realizing that the institution they had joined was carrying a debt they had inherited without knowing. He called her. This was not protocol. Protocol was for lawyers to communicate with lawyers, but he called her directly. He said, "I want you to know that I'm personally committed to ensuring this is addressed properly." She said, "I appreciate that." He said, "I reviewed Dr. Caldwell's personnel file. His departure in 1980 is recorded as a voluntary resignation to pursue private sector opportunities. There's no record of any relationship between his departure and the dissertation review process." She said, "I know." He said, "I'm not able to speak to what happened in 1979. I wasn't here. But I want to be clear that the institution's position is one of cooperation, not resistance." She said, "Good, then cooperate." She did not say it unkindly, but she said it without softness, because she had been doing this long enough to know that cooperation declared in phone calls was not the same as cooperation demonstrated in document production and expert access and timeline transparency. He demonstrated it. The cooperation that followed was genuine. Whether it was genuine because of principle or because Renata had made clear, through the precise language of her correspondence, that the alternative to cooperative engagement was public engagement, she did not know and did not need to know. The documents came, the archives opened, the university's own historian spent a month pulling files from the 1975 to 1985 period and organizing them in chronological order for the independent experts to review. What the files showed, in the bureaucratic language of faculty meeting minutes and departmental correspondence and administrative records, was a timeline that aligned precisely with what Vernon had described. The dissertation review request, the extensions, the careful language of the department chair's communications, and in an accordion folder in a box labeled Caldwell H. Emeritus Files, archived 2003, a single memorandum that no one appeared to have reviewed since it was filed. Dated September 1979, addressed to Dr. Caldwell from a name associated with Vantage System Solutions. One paragraph. It referenced his review of certain mathematical materials and expressed the company's interest in a consulting arrangement pending confirmation that the materials in question would be available for exclusive development. Renata read this memorandum and sat with it for a long time. Then she made 3 calls. Her law school contact, specializing in IP, the Carnegie Mellon historian she had already engaged, and a reporter at a major national newspaper who had covered intellectual property stories before and who she trusted to handle source materials with appropriate care. She did not give the reporter anything yet. She wanted to be sure of what she had before the story went anywhere it couldn't be recalled from. But she made the call. She wanted someone she trusted to know the shape of it. What happened next changed everything. The notebooks were assessed by 2 independent experts in the history of mathematics and cryptographic systems, both selected by Renata and agreed to by the university. The first expert, a professor at Carnegie Mellon, spent 3 weeks with the materials and produced a 40-page report that established within reasonable academic certainty that the theoretical framework in Vernon Polk's notebooks predated the Vantage System Solutions patent by a minimum of 7 years. The second expert, a retired NSA cryptographer who agreed to review the materials after Renata contacted him through a colleague, was more specific. He said that the notation in the 1978-era notebooks was not merely adjacent to the patented system. It was, in his professional opinion, the same system, worked from the same theoretical roots. He submitted his assessment in writing. He also, without being asked, sent a copy to a contact he had at the National Security Agency. The NSA did not respond publicly, but within 3 weeks of the submission, the university received a quiet inquiry from a federal agency, asking about the provenance of the room and its contents, and whether the materials had been shared with any outside parties. The inquiry was, Renata noted, careful in its language. Not threatening, not hostile. Careful. The language of people who were trying to understand the shape of a situation before deciding what to do about it. She took that as information. Vernon spent most of those months in his vegetable garden and his woodworking shop. He built a blanket chest for Renata's oldest daughter, jointed and dovetailed with the patience of a man who measured twice. He replanted the raised beds for winter greens. He called his daughter every Sunday and listened to the week's developments with the equanimity of someone who had already done his waiting and was not especially interested in doing more of it. He was, in those months, more comfortable than he had been in years, not because the situation was comfortable, but because the compartment that had held the weight of the secret for 35 years was no longer sealed, and the weight was now distributed across more people, and the redistribution had made it easier to carry. He had not expected this. He had expected the opposite, exposure feeling worse than containment, the vulnerability of being known. Instead, he found that the thing he had held alone was simply lighter when others were holding it with him. He did not romanticize this. He was a precise man. He understood that the weight was still the same weight, that the mathematics were the same mathematics, that the years were the same years. But physics was physics, and force distributed across surface area held more effectively than force concentrated at a single point, and this was as true for human experience as it was for dovetail joints. He worked on the blanket chest with care. He had been woodworking for 20 years, since Renata was a teenager, and had told him that he needed a hobby that wasn't mathematics, which was an accurate assessment. He had discovered in woodworking a different kind of problem-solving, spatial rather than symbolic, working with grain and moisture and mechanical tolerance rather than notation and proof. The two modes of thought were related at the level of structure, he found, both concerned with the deep logic of how things fit together. He had never said this to anyone because it would have sounded like an apology for mathematics, and he had nothing to apologize for. The chest was built in white oak. He had chosen the wood for its grain pattern, tight and specific, and for its durability, because he wanted the chest to last long enough for Clara's children to use it. This was the kind of thinking he had never allowed himself before, thinking about what persisted, what carried forward. He had spent 35 years not thinking about what carried forward because the answer had been too painful to hold clearly. Now he let himself think about it. The work was carrying forward. In the notebooks, in the experts' reports, in Renata's case files, in the congressional record that was being assembled, in the correction that would be entered into a patent database, in the Howard University professor's article, in the conversations that were now happening in places Vernon did not have direct access to, but could feel the shape of, the way you feel the shape of something large moving in water, from the disturbance in what surrounds it. He finished the chest, ran his hand along the surface. The wood was smooth without being slick, the grain visible, the joinery tight. He thought about the dovetail joints in the corners and about the logic of them, the way they locked under pressure, the way they grew stronger when force was applied. He thought about his granddaughter, who did not know him well enough yet. He was going to fix that. He did not give interviews. He did not speak to journalists, several of whom found their way to his phone number through paths he did not trace. He referred them all to Renata. Renata was selective in what she agreed to. One interview she agreed to was with a mathematics professor at Howard University who published a piece in a journal on the history of black scientific contributions in America. The piece was long and careful and documented Vernon's work in the context of a broader pattern. black scientists and mathematicians whose contributions had been absorbed into institutional structures without attribution, whose names had not appeared on patents or in textbooks, whose labor had made systems that others profited from. The article circulated in academic circles, then in broader circles, then into the kind of conversation that happens on the internet, fast and loud, and sometimes reductive, and sometimes genuinely illuminating. Vernon read it once. He thought it was accurate. He set it aside and went back to the blanket chest. It was Tyler who drove down to Vernon's house to tell him about the patent office. He didn't have to. It was not his job. He was a 24-year-old security officer who had found an anomaly in a key inventory form and had followed it down a staircase into a basement room and had somehow ended up as a peripheral figure in something he still didn't entirely understand. But he had been at the meetings. He had watched Vernon tell his story in the security conference room with that stillness that Tyler had at first read as resignation and had slowly come to understand was something else, something harder and more intentional, the stillness of a man who had made peace with his situation without accepting it. He drove to the house on a Saturday morning. Vernon was in the garage at the workbench, sanding the side panels of the blanket chest. Tyler knocked on the open door. Vernon looked up, set down the sandpaper. Tyler told him that the United States Patent Office had received a petition for review of Patent 4618-94. The petition had been submitted by the federal agency that had sent the quiet inquiry to the university, acting in coordination with Renata's legal team. The patent was being reviewed for potential misattribution of foundational intellectual property. Vernon listened. He did not change expression. The review would take time, Tyler said. Maybe a year, maybe more. But it was happening. Vernon nodded. Tyler didn't know what he had expected. Some visible relief, maybe. Some release of the thing that had been held for 40 years. Vernon picked up the sandpaper, turned back to the chest. "You want some coffee?" he asked. Tyler stayed for 2 hours. Vernon showed him the dovetail joints, explained the geometry of them, how a corner cut at the right angle creates a mechanical lock that holds without any adhesive at all, force distributed across surface area, the physics of things that hold together. At some point Tyler asked him if he was okay. Vernon ran his hand along the grain of the wood, thinking. "I've been okay for a long time," he said. "I made my peace with the work existing whether or not anyone knew it was mine." He paused. "But I'd be lying if I said I didn't want them to know." He looked at the chest. "My granddaughter is going to keep blankets in this. She doesn't know that her grandfather built it. She'll know it's there and she'll use it, and it'll be part of her life and she won't think about where it came from." He was quiet for a moment. "That's how it was supposed to go. I was supposed to be invisible." He looked at Tyler. "I don't want to be invisible anymore." The congressional hearing was the kind of thing that happens after the fact, after the facts have been established by other processes, slower and less visible, and what remains is the formal acknowledgement that everyone in the room already knows is necessary. Tyler had driven to Washington the night before. He had not been asked to attend. He was a 24-year-old security officer from Crestfield with no connection to Vernon Polk's case beyond the fact of having found a number that didn't add up. But he had been at the meetings. He had watched Vernon speak in the security conference room with a stillness that he had first read as resignation and slowly understood was something else entirely. He had stood in the sub-basement room and touched the notebooks and felt the weight of what was in them in the way that you sometimes feel the weight of something before you fully understand it. He had driven 4 hours to Washington because he needed to see how the story ended, and also because he had begun to understand that stories like this one did not end. They arrived somewhere, which was different. He arrived early. The hearing room was smaller than he had imagined from news coverage of such things. Wood-paneled walls, rows of observer seats, a long table at the front with microphones and name placards, and the specific institutional quality of spaces designed for accountability. He found a seat in the third row of the observer section, which was filling slowly. Vernon arrived at 8:50 with Renata. He was wearing a dark suit that fit well. His posture was the same as always, correct and undemonstrative, the posture of a man who had pressed his clothes for 35 years and stood straight in them, because that was what you did. Renata sat beside him and placed a leather folder on the table and looked at the room with the professional assessment of an attorney evaluating a space. Behind them came others. 3 mathematicians, Vernon's age, people Tyler didn't recognize, who greeted Vernon with the particular warmth of people reunited after a long separation. A woman who might have been his age, who embraced Renata and held Vernon's hand for a moment without speaking. Several people from the Howard University Mathematics Department, whose presence Tyler recognized from the article he had read 3 times. The NSA cryptographer who had submitted the expert assessment and had, apparently, decided that being present in the room when the assessment was formally acknowledged mattered to him. Tyler watched Vernon greet each person. There was something in the greetings that was not quite reunion, because these were not all people Vernon had known well, or in some cases at all. It was more like recognition. The recognition of people who had been part of the same story from different vantages, who were gathered now in the same room to watch the story step from private knowledge into public record. It was a subcommittee hearing on intellectual property and scientific attribution, scheduled on a Wednesday morning in March, in a room in the Rayburn House office building that seated perhaps 60 people in the observer section. Vernon wore a dark suit. Renata sat beside him. Behind them, in the observer seats, were 3 people Vernon had known in graduate school, other mathematicians from his era who had followed the case and made the trip, and a woman who had been a graduate student at Crestfield 2 years behind him, and who had once borrowed his lecture notes and still remembered the precision of them. The chair of the subcommittee was a congresswoman from Maryland who had a background in patent law. She had read the case materials. She spoke about them with specific accuracy, not the soft generality of someone performing awareness, but the sharpness of someone who had done the work. She acknowledged the math. She acknowledged the timeline. She acknowledged the MIT lawyer's letter, which Renata had found in a box in Vernon's garage, in a manila folder labeled Keep, which was perhaps the most painful thing Tyler had heard since the day in the basement, that Vernon had received a legal threat meant to silence him and had filed it under Keep. She acknowledged the pattern, not just Vernon's case but the broader one, the one the Howard University professor had written about, the long American tradition of failing to protect the intellectual contributions of black scientists and mathematicians, because the institutions that held power over attribution had not been built to see them as the sources of that power. She asked Vernon if he would like to make a statement. He had prepared one, 2 pages, handwritten, typed up by Renata. He had read it once, memorized the parts he wanted to say from memory, and left the rest on paper in case his voice did. He began by saying that he was not there to be angry. He said this because it was true, and because he understood that some people in the room would have found it easier if he were angry, easier to hold, easier to process, and he did not want to give them that convenience. He said he was there because the work was real. He said that the mathematics he had developed in a basement room at Crestfield University in 1978 was real, was provable, was documented, and was the theoretical basis for systems that were still in use. He said that he had not come forward for 40 years because he had understood, at 29, what coming forward would cost and what it would not gain. He said that understanding had not made him wrong, which was the hard part. It had made him correct. And being correctly afraid of something that should not have been frightening was not a comfort. He said he was 68 years old. He said his daughter was sitting beside him, and his grandchildren were at home in Charlotte, and they were going to know now something about where they came from that he had never been able to tell them cleanly. He said he was not asking for vindication. He said vindication was a word that implied the loss had been recoverable, and he was not going to tell that lie in a congressional hearing. What he was asking for was accurate record. He said he wanted his name in the record. He said that because the mathematics existed in a room for 40 years with no name attached to it, and the patent existed in a federal database for 36 years with the wrong name attached to it, and the difference between those two things was not mathematics. He set the paper down. The room was quiet. The Congresswoman said for the record that the subcommittee intended to issue a formal recommendation that the patent review include consideration of derivative attribution and that the findings be transmitted to the relevant federal agencies. She also said something that was not part of the formal record, but that Tyler, sitting in the observer section, wrote down in his phone as she said it because he knew he would want to remember it exactly. She said, "Mr. Polk, I want to be clear that the work was seen. It was just seen by people who chose not to say so, and that is a distinction that matters. Today, this subcommittee sees it. Your country sees it. And your name is in the record." Vernon nodded once. His face did not change. But his hand, which had been resting flat on the table, closed slowly into a fist and then opened again. And that motion, Tyler thought, was probably the most Vernon Polk had ever let anyone see of what he was holding. The patent review took 14 months. The final determination by the United States Patent and Trademark Office found that Patent 4,118,094, issued to Vantage System Solutions in 1987, incorporated theoretical foundations substantially identical to work documented in materials predating the patent application by a minimum of 9 years. The determination recommended that the patent record be amended to include Vernon Polk as a foundational contributor and that his work be formally cited in the patent documentation. Vantage System Solutions had dissolved in 1999. Dr. Harold Caldwell had died in 2003. The federal agency that held the patent rights issued a statement acknowledging the determination and expressing regret for the circumstances that had led to the original misattribution. The statement used the word regret. Renata read it and then set her phone on the kitchen counter and stood in her kitchen for a while. Her father, when she called him, said that regret was a word people used when they wanted to acknowledge something without accepting responsibility for it, and that he had understood that distinction for most of his adult life and was not going to stop understanding it now. "But," she said, because she knew his voice. A pause. "But it's something," he said. "It's the first something in 40 years." The Smithsonian's National Museum of American History reached out to Renata in the spring. They were developing an exhibition on the history of American cryptography and its contributors, and the Vernon Polk case had come to the attention of the curator. They wanted to know if Vernon would be willing to loan the notebooks for display. He went to Washington to meet with the curator. Renata went with him. The curator was a woman in her late 50s who spoke about the notebooks with the reverence of someone who understood what they were holding. She had arranged for a cryptography historian to be present at the meeting, a man from MIT, and the three of them sat with Vernon in a small conference room and talked about the work in terms that Vernon had not used with another person since 1979. The mathematician in him came to the surface in that room in a way that Tyler, had he been there, would not have recognized from the basement, from the conference table, from the hearing. He used notation that required him to pull a pen from his pocket and write on a notepad. He corrected a mischaracterization of one of the framework's properties with a patience that was not kindness, but precision. He answered questions with the efficiency of someone who had been thinking about a problem for 40 years and had the answers sorted. The curator watched him. When the meeting ended, as they were gathering their things, she said, "Mr. Polk, can I ask you something personal?" He looked at her. "Do you still think about the mathematics?" she asked. He put the cap back on his pen, looked at the notepad with the notation on it. "Every day," he said. "I haven't stopped." "Is there more?" she asked. "Beyond what's in the notebooks?" He smiled, the first genuine smile anyone in that room had seen from him. Small, but real. 30 years more, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Would you be willing to talk to someone at the National Science Foundation?" she asked. He considered this. He was 68 years old. He had a vegetable garden and a woodworking shop, and 3 grandchildren and a daughter who called him every Sunday. Yes, he said, I think I would. I think I would. The exhibit opened in October, 14 months after Tyler Brandt had found the discrepancy in the key inventory form. It occupied a long room on the second floor of the museum, its walls lined with the kind of deep color that archivists use to evoke the weight of history. The notebooks were displayed in a central case, open to carefully chosen pages, the notation visible under museum-grade lighting. Beside them, mounted on archival board, were photographs. Vernon, as a graduate student, 1977, standing outside Whitmore Hall, one of 2 photographs that existed from that period, located by the museum's research staff in the university's archive. Vernon in the basement room, taken during the initial documentation process by Diane Okafor's team. Vernon at the congressional hearing. The exhibit text was written in plain language, with the mathematics explained in terms accessible to non-specialists. The title panel read, Vernon Polk, mathematician, custodian. The work he did, and how long it took the world to know it. On the opening morning, Renata brought her 3 children. The oldest was 12, a girl named Clara, who had been told some version of the story in age-appropriate terms for the past year, and who stood before the central case looking at the notebooks with the expression of a child encountering something larger than she had a framework for. What did he use them for? Clara asked. The notebooks. Keeping track, Renata said, keeping everything in one place so it wouldn't be lost. Clara looked at the open page, the notation, the small, precise handwriting. Why didn't he just tell someone? Renata stood beside her daughter and looked at the page. He did, she said. It just took a while for anyone to listen. Tyler arrived at the exhibit mid-morning, off-duty, in his own clothes. He had not been invited specifically, but he had seen the announcement online, and he had taken the train from Crestfield, and he had found the room on the second floor, and he had stood in the entrance for a moment, looking at the space, before going in. Vernon was there, standing near the central case wearing a dark suit, talking with a woman from the museum's curatorial staff. He looked different here than he had in the basement, different than he had in the security conference room or the congressional hearing. Not older, not younger, more complete somehow. The way a thing looks when it is in the context that was always meant for it. Tyler walked over when the curator moved on. Vernon looked at him. Recognition, something warmer. You came, Vernon said. Tyler shrugged. Felt stupid about the shrug immediately. Cleared his throat. I found a key, he said. In an inventory form. Vernon smiled. The genuine one, the small one. 42 when the record said 41, Tyler continued. I almost just amended the log and let it go. Vernon looked at him. Why didn't you? Tyler thought about it. He had thought about it on the train. He had thought about it since October, since the basement, since all of it. I don't know, he said. Something felt wrong about it. When a number doesn't add up, you're supposed to find out why. Vernon nodded. He looked at the case, at the notebooks. That's mathematics, he said. When the numbers don't reconcile, you go back and find what's missing. He looked at Tyler. You did the math, he said. That afternoon, in the museum's small cafe, Vernon sat with Renata and the grandchildren and ate a sandwich and drank coffee from a paper cup, and watched his oldest granddaughter draw on a museum map with a borrowed pen, filling in the blank spaces with her own notation, loops and angles that meant nothing and everything. He was not a vindicated man. He was not a restored man. He was a man who had worked for 40 years in a basement and another 35 years in a hallway outside a locked door, and who had been correct about the mathematics and incorrect about the world's interest in knowing, and who had eventually been shown that the world's interest had simply been deferred. He had been invisible. He was less invisible now. He was not sure what came next, and he was, for the first time in a long time, curious about it. Not hopeful exactly, because hope implied a specific outcome, and he had learned not to attach himself to specific outcomes, but curious, interested, present in a way that felt different from the present he had inhabited for 3.5 decades. His granddaughter looked up from the map. Grandpa, she said, What does this mean?" She pointed to the notation on the exhibit panel visible from where they were sitting, the large format reproduction of a page from one of the notebooks. He looked at it. "It's a way of describing how two things can share a secret," he said, "without either of them having to say it out loud." She considered this with the seriousness of a child encountering an idea for the first time. "Can people do that?" she asked. He looked at the notation, at his own handwriting reproduced on the wall of a museum, attributed to his name. "They can," he said, "but it's better when they don't have to." In the years that followed, the work continued, not as redemption, not as resolution, as continuation, the way mathematics continues, each answer opening toward the next question, each proof suggesting the existence of the proof that hasn't yet been written. The National Science Foundation arranged a collaboration between Vernon and a team of cryptographers at 2 universities. He was not a professor. He held no academic title. He drove to the university twice a week and sat in a seminar room with people who were younger than his daughter, and talked about key generation systems with the specificity of 40 years of solitary thought and the patience of a man who had never been in a hurry because he had never had anywhere to hurry to. The collaboration produced 3 papers in its first 2 years. Vernon's name appeared on all 3, not first among several, not acknowledged in the footnotes, in the byline, his name in the record. He continued to keep notebooks, black hardcover composition notebooks, the same kind, because he had worked in them for 40 years and the habit of them was in his hands. He kept them at home now, on a shelf in the woodworking shop, beside the tools and the wood and the half-finished projects. They were not hidden. There was no reason to hide them. His granddaughter, Clara, who was 13 by the time the first paper was published, asked him once to explain what the paper was about. He spent 45 minutes at his workbench, explaining it to her in terms that moved from simple to complex, as she asked questions, following her understanding, finding the level of abstraction where she could see the shape of it. At the end, she said, "So you found a way to prove that something is real without showing the thing itself?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly what it is." She nodded, went back to the book she had been reading. He sat with the notebook open in front of him and the evening light coming through the garage window, and thought about the 40 years in the basement room, and the 35 years in the corridor outside, and the 5 years since Tyler had found a number that didn't add up, and he thought about his granddaughter's formulation, proving that something is real without showing the thing itself, and he thought that she had, at 13, understood something that had taken the world considerably longer. The work was real. It had always been real, and it had been in the record, in the notebooks, in the notation on those pages, for 40 years before anyone came to read it. Some things exist before they are known. Some truths wait in locked rooms for the right question to be asked. And some men push mops down hallways for 35 years and carry a key they never returned, and keep every number in their head, and wait, with the patience of mathematicians who understand that time is not an obstacle to proof, but simply a variable, for the equation to finally balance. The morning light filled the garage. Vernon opened the notebook, picked up the pen, and began. Not because there was anything left to prove. The proof was already in the record, in the museums, in the congressional transcript, in the patent database that now carried his name alongside the work it had carried without his name for 36 years. Not because he needed to justify the years. The years were their own justification, each one a document of a man who had refused to stop, who had continued past the point where continuing made obvious sense, who had held the key. He began because the mathematics was not finished. It had never been finished. That was the nature of it. Each proof opened toward the next question. Each system suggested the existence of the system beyond it. Each answer was provisional in the way that all true answers were provisional, accurate to the limits of current knowledge, and pointing clearly past those limits toward what remained unknown. He was 68 years old. He had, if the actuarial tables were to be consulted, perhaps 15 to 20 productive years of work ahead of him. He had always considered actuarial tables a form of rough estimate, which was the mathematician's way of saying he did not intend to be governed by them. He wrote. Outside, the Tennessee morning was doing what October mornings did, cold and clean and full of the specific light that came at that angle in that season, and lasted for 3 weeks, and then was gone. The vegetable beds were cleared, the blanket chest was delivered, the grandchildren were growing. He wrote. The notebook filled slowly, page by page, in the handwriting that was so small and precise it was almost printed. The handwriting of a man who had learned early that space on a page was finite, and thought was not, and had organized himself accordingly. The work continued, as it had always continued, as it would continue. Beyond him, beyond the notebooks, beyond the museum case and the congressional record and the amended patent database, into the work of the mathematicians who had read his papers and would build from them, and the mathematicians after them, and the generations of students who would encounter his name in a footnote or a textbook attribution or a museum placard, and would feel, briefly, the pull of curiosity about the man behind the name, and would ask a question about him, and would receive an answer that included the words custodian and mathematician and basement and key, and would sit with that for a moment, and would perhaps understand something about how knowledge survives, and how long it sometimes has to wait, and what it costs the person who carries it through the waiting. The morning light held, the pen moved, the page filled, and somewhere in the building that had once been just a university and was now also an archive and a record and a story that would be told in the telling of other stories, in the sub-basement of Whitmore Hall, the door to room B7 stood open. Unlocked at last, empty of its secrets, full of its history. The room where a mathematician had worked in silence for 12 years, and then a janitor had cleaned the corridor outside for 35, and then a security officer had asked the right question, and then the truth had found the light it had been waiting for. Not because the world had become just, but because one man had kept a key, and one young man had known that when the numbers didn't reconcile, you went back and found what was missing, and what was missing had been there all along.